Welcome to the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation's Holocaust Education Series. I am your host, Elizabeth Hess. Today I am honored to be joined by Professor Rachelle Grossman, an assistant professor of comparative literature at the University of Illinois. Her work focuses on Yiddish literature and its transnational connections, especially the transformation of literary centers and peripheries in post-war periods. Professor Grossman, you have brought two of your students today, Katie and Anel, to talk about a thoughtful project that you've developed as part of your Holocaust education coursework. I want to hear all the details about that, and I want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Grossman, let's begin with what led you here to the University of Illinois to teach and this particular topic. What drew you to this?
I'll say I am fairly new to town. I arrived here in August. I'm just finishing up now my first year on the faculty here at the university. I came here because there is a phenomenal program in comparative and world literature, and I am so delighted to have gotten this fantastic position to teach generally in this subject, but more specifically to teach Jewish literature. And as you mentioned, my specialty is Yiddish, and this was of particular interest precisely because of how Yiddish as the diasporic language can help us answer interesting questions about world literature, circulation, migration, questions of literary cultural reconstruction after war. And that's precisely what we think about in this class that I have these lovely students who are speaking with us, who are in my class, Responses to the Holocaust, which is a course that I taught this semester precisely about the question of the post-war and how do we think about the Holocaust? How do writers and cultural figures respond to the Holocaust, both by publishing things that were written during those war years and also after the fact? And what does that look like? How can we understand it?
Let's flash forward to this coursework that you're teaching right now in the project. Can you give us an overview and how you got Katie and Anel interested in what you're doing?
I hope they'll speak to what particularly interesting to them in their specifics. The course is designed with 3 large reports throughout the semester, each report having a component that's about historical and cultural context, and then a section that is focusing on analyzing a particular work. And in the first report, students engaged with materials from the Ringelblum archive, also known as the Oinig Shabbos, which was a clandestine archive made up of everyday materials with the goal to capture and understand the kinds of unique aspects of Jewish life in extremis. And once it became abundantly clear that the objective of the Nazis was extermination, this project took on quite a serious, intense resonance to leave a trace of the lives that people had lived. And so students took materials from this archive that have been translated and published in an anthology and did intensive reports writing about both the historical, cultural context and also analyzing literature from a literary critical perspective. And this same structure carried through to the other 2 reports. The second, students went to the archives of the Shoah Foundation. They wrote about the historical context of the life of the person that they profiled, and then they analyzed a specific segment of the testimony to think about not only what people say, but precisely how they say it, and how the delivery of testimony is also a narrative, and what those narrative components look like. How does it affect how we understand a story? And what do we expect from Holocaust stories? And finally, the third report focused on a work of Holocaust literature, film, or music in the world, which is to say, students chose any number of projects based on a particular work. And they thought about not only analyzing the work itself, but also thinking about a particular controversy that this work was at the center of. So, for example, the inspiration for this particular focus was Art Spiegelman's work, Maus, and the ways in which Maus in recent years has become a focal point for book banning in particular places in the United States. And students took up different projects on the same kind of structure to think about why Holocaust literature causes such particularly strong reactions. That's sort of the general structure of these reports, and Katie and Anel have both done exceptional work this semester in all of their reports. I'm hoping they can share with us some of that work.
Professor Grossman, when you create the curriculum for college age students, is it safe to assume you assemble the materials based on what you want them to learn, not who your audience will be? Your students aren't all Jewish, and they're of all faiths and ethnicities. Do you tailor your curriculum to a wider audience, knowing that most of your students won't be from Jewish backgrounds? And what is the religious makeup of this past semester's students?
I would say that this class has about 30 students, and not very many of them are Jewish. And I think that that is a part of being a professor also at such a large public school, that there's a wide variety of students from different backgrounds. Nevertheless, I think the subject of the Holocaust is a really important and compelling subject that brings a lot of students from different backgrounds to learn about this chapter in history and the particular lessons that we might take from that.
I would like to come back to that in a second, but first I would like to talk to the students and talk to them about why and how they got involved in this project. I'll start with you, Katie. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you are in school, and what drew you to this project?
All right, of course. I'm Katie. I'm a sophomore here at UIUC. I'm technically a business student, but I'm also pursuing a minor in comparative world literature, which is something I've really been enjoying. I think that's the classwork that I've been having the most interest in. I took this class because it was a requirement for my minor, actually. It's part of the comparative literature curriculum. But while I was in there, I was picking up my classes, and this one kind of stood out. I had not really taken like a Holocaust class before, but I had read materials like I'd read Mouse before for another class. I'd read today's Borowski's This Way for the Gas for another class as well. I think Professor Grossman also teaches that one this semester. I had brushed with Holocaust literature, and I've found while I've been in this class, I've really been engaging with it and learned a lot about Holocaust literature, but also Jewish literature and just all kinds of interesting things I never really knew before.
You mentioned, I believe, off the air that you had written a paper about something that Professor Grossman had mentioned. Can you talk about that a little bit?
This was the first report that we did. I wrote a paper on Liv Golden's Chronicle of a Single Day, which is just a really fantastic short work. It's the only one that survived of Liv Golden's writing, but it has so many of these really intense, like modernist literary references. It is self contained and it's really fantastic. And it was something I'd never heard of before. It's not like a famous work like something like Night or Diary of Anne Frank. It was just something that was so rich and I fully had just never heard of it. And I think that was one of the real strengths of this class is being able to research ourselves and like look into things independently. And also the texts that we engage with in class, we read some very famous ones and we also read ones that just people don't really discuss that much.
Anel, can you tell me a little bit about where you are in school and what drew you to this class?
I am also a sophomore, but my major is animal science with a pre-vet concentration, which kind of is a little different to how many students their majors are mostly in literature. What specifically drew me to this class, although it was a requirement, I feel like it was more of a personal interest because as soon as I saw the name about Holocaust, like I was like, it reminded me of being in seventh grade and watching Schindler's List. I feel like was a very like graphical and like it had a lot of mature themes for seventh graders, but to me it really changed my perspective on how I view the world, and it also taught me about how I wasn't aware that a lot of schools deprive students of this sort of content because I guess also the graphic violence. But I feel like this class was a sort of a way to bring awareness to other people around me about anti-Semitism and how it really affects the way people view the world.
Anel, as we wrap up this school year, what would you like people to know that you've learned that you may not have known before this and that other people may not know? What have you learned from this course?
I have learned a lot of things from this course, specifically about the archives. In the past, I did watch some movies about the Holocaust and read some books like Night. I feel like learning about the visual archives and also about the poems that were preserved from the Holocaust really changed my perspective on how it's sort of like a first person experience of they sat there and wrote these poems and were experiencing this firsthand. It's very impacting because I would never imagine that in such a world, someone would be able to actually document their thoughts and people would be able to find this and preserve it and be able to pass it down through generations.
Professor Grossman, I'm going to come back to you now that you've heard from both of your students. What are you hoping that they get out of this course?
Well, I think what was important to me as I planned my semester and my lectures was to balance the teaching of the historical context with the literature itself. That I think we absolutely needed a particular kind of historical grounding in order to understand the history and the context in which these materials were produced. But it was also important to me that we could approach these literary works as literature, and also to understand that these are pieces of art. They're constructed as particular narratives, stories. And to say that something's a story isn't to diminish it. In fact, I think that there's a way in which a work of literature can reach us in different times that a work of news, let's say, or something that's nonfiction, even though we've also definitely read nonfiction, but the way in which literature can reach us and affect us and depict things that we might not otherwise be able to access. For me, it was really important to have both the history, but also the focus on analyzing the literature and understanding it as literature, and to understand what people living through this event were trying to communicate about this experience. Those things for me are very important. And then additionally, I think that the students, Katie and Anel, maybe in particular, you guys have talked about the ways in which doing the work itself gave you some ownership over your learning, to be able to go into the archives, to choose from this anthology, to think about this entire body of work that's called Holocaust literature, and to find ways into it, to analyze it, and to understand it. And that to me is also important, to have facility with material like this, to be able to analyze it and to encounter it and to think about what is happening there. Those are some of my goals, and I think we did it.
Katie, let me build on that. In analyzing the literature, how is it different from other classes you've taken in high school and up until this point in your sophomore year? It doesn't feel like to you it was just analyzing text. It feels a little more personal or passionate. Can you talk about that?
I have noticed in a lot of, especially middle school and high school kind of Holocaust education, there's a tendency to focus very much on statistics and like general historical details. And that's very important, obviously, but I think sometimes that there are things that can get lost. You can kind of forget about individual people, that they had lives and families and interiority that is sometimes lost when you think about things only in terms of history. And I definitely agree with Professor Grossman's approach where we were looking at things as literature, because literature is something I love so dearly. It's so important to me. And I think analyzing these works as literature is just so important, because it can kind of get overshadowed that these are artistic works when we just look at them as history or even testimony or journalism only. A big element to it is a little bit of the agency that we have as students to seek out testimonies ourselves or to look for materials ourselves. The fact that I went to the library and I would go and I would search through the main stacks and try and find materials that were relevant to my papers, I feel like I was so much more directly engaged in that material. And in doing that, that also got me to engage more directly with, I feel like, the people who were writing these things, where I could think about it from like a historical perspective, but also look at them as artists and sort of merge those two approaches together to really feel more connected to the work.
And now I'm going to ask you a similar question, but slightly differently. When you were analyzing the text, it's intense. How were you able to compartmentalize those and analyze the text, or was it emotional and you had to step away from it at times?
Yeah, definitely. It was very powerful pieces that we were learning and also doing literary analysis on, because being able to read a poem and actually read about what they experienced, it was very detailed. I don't feel like there were moments where I had to walk away from it, but I do feel like it really helped me mature on the subject, because I feel like specifically when I did about the Voices from the Warsaw Ghetto, when we were talking about earlier, I specifically did a literary analysis of a poem called Songs of Hunger. And it was just a very detailed poem about how families struggle to obtain food. And it was something that I've never been presented with in the past, and it was a way for me to not just learn how to do lyric analysis on poems, but also learn a little more deeply about how individual people suffered during the Holocaust, because I feel like a lot of people had very different experiences. There were many ghettos, many concentration camps that I feel like each story has its own way of expressing a different experience, and some a little more gruesome than others.
Professor Grossman, how do you, listening to this, get the students through the harder materials while still reminding them this is why we're learning about it, this can't happen again, which is exactly why we're doing it? How do you thread that?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, I myself encountered this material, having read it all many times before, considering also that I assigned it and that I write about this in my own work, but I also have a strong reaction to the material. And sometimes I found the weeks were extremely difficult to get through. Often I do a lot of my grading at night, and I had to make a rule for myself not to approach this material after 5 p.m. because I couldn't sleep. So, in bringing students along into the literature, I don't know, I think it's important to be vulnerable as a professor sometimes, that this is also my experience, even as somebody who has encountered this material many times, to be upfront about that with students who are only learning about this maybe for the first time. Certainly, a lot of the materials we looked at are newly translated from Yiddish, from Polish, and other languages. And so they are not well known stories, along with some of the most canonical, Night and the Diary of Anne Frank, and so on. I think it's useful actually to approach it from the dual perspective that this is material that's helping us understand this historical moment, these events, and the structures of them, and also to be able to say, let's look at how the particular tone of this story is constructed, or what is the author trying to say, and how are they saying it? What does a memoir allow somebody to say that a poem doesn't, or vice versa? That I think that helps us also understand it emotionally, but also to help us get beyond our own immediate reactions and to think about the words too, and what they're saying. And also, our reactions are also important and valid and part of what is trying to be produced by the text.
Katie, are you surprised by your professor's answer that she can't read it late in the evening? Does that surprise you at all that it still hits her emotionally?
It is kind of nice to hear that our professors have this kind of same reaction to the material, because I know sometimes it would hit me all at once. I didn't know how to respond, because sometimes when looking at the stuff so analytically, there's a tendency to maybe let it fade into the background a little bit and let kind of the horror just wash over you and you don't really think about it directly. But when you have that moment, when you think about, oh, the real person who wrote this or the real person who experienced this, it can be like really exhausting and kind of just emotionally draining. And it's nice to know that just a thing so many people working with Holocaust material just deal with and work through in their own ways.
Anel, this is a difficult question because you never know what you're going to do until you're in a situation. But if you encountered a Holocaust denier, do you know what words you would be able to come up with to try to explain to them, no, this happened?
I feel like for someone to say that the Holocaust never happened is just completely ignore, especially the ongoing impact of hatred and injustice. And I feel like the Holocaust is something that you can't just shy away from or pretend like it never happened, because the facts are there, the evidence is there. It's all right in front of us. Like, we see it in books, we see it in movies. I would tell them, I'd be like, have you never seen a movie like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, Schindler's List, read a book about Anne Frank? There's so much evidence out there. It's like it happened, and I feel like for someone to be so ignorant about it, it's just another way for them to tell us that they'll look the other way when systemic oppression is facing us right in the face. It's something that I feel like every school, everyone should at least be able to sit down and learn about and actually take in that information and know that this is something real.
Professor Grossman or Katie, anti-Semitism is on the rise. I would ask you the same question. How would you answer that? I'm guessing, Professor Grossman, you have encountered
I think
Holocaust deniers. I'll
that
start with you.
our current moment is quite a challenge, and there are many times in which people drawing parallels to the events of the Holocaust and thinking about our current events today. I think that's something that we should think about seriously and critically. I think one strange moment for me was at the beginning of the semester, we began by talking about the Nuremberg laws and the ways in which Nazi Germany in the 30s enacted legislation that slowly deprived Jewish people of their legal rights. It was unsettling to me to be teaching about these events from the 1930s while contemporary events in the United States were taking place related to executive orders and suggesting particular things about birthright citizenship, let's say, and other elements of, until now, uncontested ideas of American law. There are some parallels like that that I think are unsettling and eerie and upsetting. I mean, I think as we discussed in thinking about the controversies surrounding works of Holocaust literature, there are often a lot of ways that ideas of the Holocaust are abstracted from this particular moment in time and used to talk about different kinds of oppression or political events or even anti-Semitism more generally. And I think it's important actually to make a distinction between the Holocaust, the lessons we might understand from the Holocaust, and then also anti-Semitism in general. And to understand the Holocaust within the context of the European anti-Semitism and how it happened and all the nuances there, and also to understand our contemporary moment similarly, differently, I mean, as a part of a continuum of history, but also in its own right. I'm always for thinking of the nuances there, which is complicated, but that's probably why I'm a professor.
Katie, do you think what happened in the late 1930s leading up to World War II, do you think that it could happen again now?
It's an interesting kind of thing to grapple with, to think about how history has inadvertently shaped our current landscape. And I think a moment for me when thinking about this is just there's so many elements of history that kind of just get sort of smoothed over into just the Holocaust, and people don't think about the very real and tangible steps that came into place before concentration camps and before mass deportations from ghettos. There were many tangible legal steps that were put in place by the National Socialist Party to make this legal. And all of the beginning part is something that people just tend to think of the end point and not realize exactly how you get there. And how you get there is Nuremberg laws and book burnings very early on, and election in 1933. Hitler was democratically elected. There is a timeline, and there's these clear steps that lead up to this that just kind of get smoothed over or like overshadowed by the looming figure of the Holocaust at the end of it all.
Before I let you go, I'd like to pose a question to all of you. With more time passing from the end of in 1945 to now, there's disinformation on the internet. What from this course and just now from your own perspective would you like people to go forward with the knowledge from what you've learned? I'll start with you, Anel.
I feel like media is a very powerful tool. I feel like if it can be used either in the right or wrong way, and I feel like it's very important to be able to spread awareness on anti-Semitism, but also spread it in the correct manner, not spreading misinformation. And it could be done so by simple as spreading about a poem you read on a book or talking about a movie that you watched that you should recommend others watching, or even the Holocaust Museum that you can go to and be informed by. I feel like there's many ways to be able to continue to keep the memory of the Holocaust. Although many victims have been able to pass it on to their generations, I feel like there are also many tools out there that can help us keep the memory alive and be able to pass it down even further.
Katie, I will ask you a similar question. What are you hoping to go forward with the information when people ask you, what was that lit class about? What would you like people to know about the memories and the stories of people who suffered?
I think the main takeaway I guess I'd like to bring is that these people were individuals and they had individual stories to tell, and it's so easy to get caught up in these things and it's so difficult to approach. It feels almost impossible. But looking on like an individual scale, it makes it more, I guess, accessible for people to learn about. And if people ask me about what I learned in this class, I think maybe first I'd probably talk about some history, talk about the basic facts and timelines and dates, but I'd also maybe mention writers that worked in the Warsaw Ghetto, these historical figures who were also people who made works of art that would be interesting to engage with, and maybe ask people to look at a poem that maybe is less read and just encourage people to, instead of doing a historical overview of the Holocaust and not thinking on it further, but to dive deeper and to maybe find someone's testimony online and like listen to that person and think about it like more personally rather than just as a moment in history.
Professor Grossman, I'll let you have the final word. As you listen to the answers of Katie and Anel, and as you're wrapping up another semester, what have you learned through the eyes of this group of students that continues to surprise you and that you haven't even learned after years of teaching?
I will say that at the beginning of the semester, I sent out a survey to all of the students as an optional way for students to share with me general information about themselves and any concerns they might have about the class. And there were many students who had kind of general anxieties about how to talk about this material, how to talk about it in a way that was respectful, or just in general, a kind of anxious feeling about engaging in this discussion. And I have to say, this class for me was really a joy to teach. Everybody was extremely respectful to one another, to the material, to me. This class was particularly excellent because of the real seriousness that everybody brought to the material and to one another and to engage in conversations with one another. So that, for one, was a surprise in a really great way. I didn't know what to expect. And then additionally, many students have told me, I mean, echoing some of what Katie and Anel have said, that this class was for them a real favorite. It sounds kind of strange when we talk about a Holocaust class as being something that we enjoy, but I don't think because we take pleasure necessarily in it, but because the material is important and it's moving and it's interesting and it has a weightiness to it that I think was really appreciated. So that kind of gravitas that the students brought to this class was for me really validating, really important so that we could have these conversations together throughout the semester about this material. So that was really phenomenal.
Thank you for listening to the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation's Holocaust Education podcast series. It has been an honor talking with Professor Rachelle Grossman, Katie, and Anel about the work you're doing to preserve and expand Holocaust education. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.